Happy Halloween, everybody, and in honor of the season, I'm using a different background. Now, at time of recording, there have been 2 videos made on my commentary on Keyblade Master and Horus, both of which are one-shots that cover the same point. The first one was by Fractured Light, which I thought was pretty good, actually. It correctly pointed out that I greatly simplified the Stanford Prison Experiment, and I apologize. With that said, I do take issue with something else Fractured said in the video. However, I decided not to cover it because that problem is better exemplified in the video I'm going to talk about as soon as this sentence is over. The other video is from Raven Pine's Commentaries and More, and Raven's video I had a few more issues with, so I'm going to cover it today. I should also note that the last time I covered a video from Raven, I made some really out-of-place comments about her voice and vocal inflections that I apologize for. Also, I'm cutting out everything before she played my point because everything before that is either context I've already explained or context that you can already find by watching my video on Keyblade and Horus.
You know, if you just ignore the part where Copycat said the reason this issue even fucking arose in the first place was because of how cumbersome having 4 players at once on screen was.
It always felt cumbersome to have 4 separate characters on screen at one time, as it forces players to stay together rather than explore on their own. This reluctance for each player to possess their own split screen has always led to frustrating moments with my friends and I, as it was inevitable that someone would lag behind. The chaos that's caused from this can be fun, but it does greatly diminish the point of co-op play, as it becomes more entertaining to troll your party rather than to help them.
People respond to the atmosphere they're in, and Copycat's point is that New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Super Mario 3D World create an atmosphere where trolling players is more fun than working together. And if you want to dispute that point, well, you'd have to respond to the idea that the game either causes that stimuli, or that humans respond to stimuli. Which, I'd love to see you try and argue that key. And if you don't believe me when I say humans respond to stimuli, well, if you want a particularly dark example, Google the Stanford Prison Experiment sometime. It's the very famous experiment from 1971, where a bunch of students at Stanford were told to roleplay as either a prisoner or a prison guard, with the guards just having the role of keeping the prisoners from escaping. And it was found that merely having the role of guard was enough to get these people to do absolutely brutal and terrible things. These are not for the faint of heart. Now, I know it's me you're thinking, Ephraim, why the fuck are you mentioning this in a video about Mario? It's because we have the same brains regardless of circumstance. How we act in one situation is honestly not that far off from how we'd act in another. Mind you, the extent of our actions might change, or how severely we look at the situation might change, but we still have the same principles no matter what. So yeah, there's your little thought for the night.
Okay. I would touch on the Stanford Prison Experiment and go on and on about it, but that would require a lot of willpower from me, and it will cause me to be driven insane in the membrane, insane in the brain. So for anyone who wants to see someone cover that part of the video, my friend Fractured Light touched on that topic really well in his one-shot commentary on the same video. A link to that video is in the description, as well as various videos on the topic and an article from the Sage Journal's website, plus Simply Psychology if you want to know more about it. By the way, Ephraim, these are 2 completely different situations. Someone having enjoyment out of taking the piss at their teammates in New Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario 3D World is just done for fun from the person doing it and nothing else. The Stanford Prison Experiment was nothing more than a cruel psychological test that had to be cut short because of how fucking unethical that experiment was, down to the participants assigned the role of guard and prisoner being in the mess of total mistreatment. There is also the fact that the Mario Bros. Games don't gaslight people, while the Stanford Prison Experiment led people to have the prisoners genuinely believing that they deserved to endure what they were enduring. Courtesy of my buddy Kagura 101.
My point wasn't that these 2 things were the exact same in literally every way, it was that environment impacts action. And I specifically acknowledged at the beginning of my interjection that the Stanford Prison Experiment was a very dark example of this occurring. To explain what I mean, let's look at this graph that I made in Google Sheets. Let's label the y-axis severity of stimuli and the x-axis assholery. Now, the New Super Mario Bros. Games are incredibly non-severe stimuli, so their place on the graph is fairly low. Compare this to Stanford Prison Experiment, which was a much more severe stimuli, and as such, the amounts of assholery would be notably higher. I'm not saying that these 2 things have the same amount of assholery, nor that the stimuli present in them is equally as severe. I'm merely making the point that you can easily plot them on the same line. I should also note that this graph is incredibly broad, so the specific justification for the assholery in response to the specific stimuli being produced is going to differ even among things that are comparable to the same data points. Now, could I have made this point more clear in my original commentary on Key and Horus? I'm willing to concede that. In the same regard, I'm willing to admit that I didn't need to use such an extreme example in order to illustrate my point. However, I should note that if Destroyer Shy's comment is any indication, at least some chunk of my fan base likes the fact that I'm willing to bring up more extreme examples that are not usually talked about in discussions like this. Either way, my issue with Raven's point is not that she's criticizing the comparison, it's that she missed the entire point of the comparison.
There's another thing that Fracture Light brought up that makes the Stanford prison experiment example a whole lot worse. Let's not pretend that this is unrepresentative, as it actually ruled out participants with neurodivergencies, meaning that they did not allow people with them to be in the experiment.
Raven Pines is redundant, and by that I mean she basically just said the same thing twice.
But that's besides the point. You say that we as a species have the same brain, which isn't entirely true, like, at all. Neurodiversity is a thing, and the average human brain can have millions upon millions of chemical reactions that can cause them to act differently in any situation under any circumstance, dire or not. These same reactions can have them evolve and change over time. Sometimes these reactions change drastically, with conditions like PTSD shrinking some parts of the brain. To expand on this even further, if we all supposedly had the same brain, then why do a lot of folks have neurological conditions like autism, ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, Tourette syndrome, etc.? Even if we allegedly have the same brain and the same principles no matter what, which is also wrong, I'll get to that in a second, we need to consider neurodiversity being a thing. You are neurodivergent yourself, correct? So why are we lumping neurodivergent people into this presumption?
This is another point that you completely missed. I didn't mean that every human being has the exact same brain. What I meant was that a human with a brain is not going to have that brain magically change depending on the circumstance they're in. You mentioned PTSD. Somebody with PTSD has PTSD every second of every day after they first get it. You are correct to say that I am neurodivergent, and that is always the case regardless of the situation I'm in. In the same regard, you began this video with essentially a trigger warning because you understand that triggers are perpetual. Let me put it like this. Remember that graph I showed you guys earlier? You still have the same brain regardless of how severe the stimuli around you is. The only difference is how strong your reaction is to the stimuli around you. To give another comparison related to PTSD, somebody with a trigger for blood, for example, is likely going to react much less severely to just seeing a picture of blood compared to somebody bleeding to death right in front of them. That doesn't mean they don't have the trigger, though, nor is their brain different in the second situation compared to the first one. It's just the severity of the situation that is causing a much more extreme reaction.
As far as the humans having the same principles go, have you ever heard of a thing called moral relativism? It's the idea that there is no absolute or universal set of moral principles. A whatever floats their boat sort of thing, if you will. So saying that we as humans have the same principles is preposterous at best and a stupid assumption at worst, especially in a discussion about Mario and co-op multiplayer of all things.
Okay, we'll ignore the fact that this interjection pretends that moral relativism is self-evident when it simply isn't. It's one of various competing ideas in philosophy, and instead point out that relativists can still have principles. They would just believe that those principles are not objective truth. A moral relativist, for example, could take a very strong stance against lying, never engage in it, and refuse to associate with anyone who engages in it, and still believe there is nothing objectively wrong with the action. When I said somebody has the same principles in all situations, I was saying that the principles that they would have, which would allow them to do something bad, are the same principles they'd have in other situations. Again, not that literally every single person on Earth has the exact same principles. So final thoughts, while this commentary was far from terrible, you missed my points, and to be honest, that made your video bad. Not really much else to say. Good night, and good luck.